The War Council smelled like boiled copper and bad decisions. I had been sitting in that room for 3 hours. The chairs were designed for Vakari anatomy, which meant 8 contact points distributed across a body shaped like a collapsed umbrella. I had 2 legs and a lower back that had stopped speaking to me somewhere around hour 2. I shifted. Again. The Vakari officer beside me glanced over with the kind of look you give a child who keeps dropping their fork at dinner. I picked up my coffee, wrong temperature again. Admiral Sothvaren stood at the head of the table, if you could call it standing, which was generous, since Vakari at rest looked more like a coat rack that had decided to have opinions. He was old, ancient by their reckoning, 40 years of command decisions written into the pale ridges along his upper carapace. Every junior officer in the room watched him the way cadets watch a textbook that can also shout at them. He was pointing at the outer rim projection with 2 of his forward limbs, tracing the Krethian Dominion's massing positions, with a patience that suggested he had already decided what to do, and was now simply performing the theater of consultation. 3 staging zones, he said, each one larger than the last engagement at Korath. The math is not complicated. The math was not complicated. He was right about that. 14 Alliance ships in this sector, roughly 40 Vakari support vessels spread across the neighboring systems, a scattering of Dorian frigates that were good in a chase but not much else, against a Krethian vanguard that, according to the intelligence on the table, numbered somewhere between 60 and 80 warships, with more coming. Everyone in the room was calculating retreat vectors. I could see it on their faces, the ones that had faces. The ones that communicated through color shifts in their skin were cycling through shades I was fairly sure meant the same thing. Commander Priel, the senior Vakari strategist, pulled up a secondary display. Defensive positions along the Reach corridor, fallback stations, supply line prioritization, the language of losing carefully, which was still losing. I drank my coffee. Commander Vasquez. My name, in Sothvaren's voice, sounded like a diplomatic formality, the kind you observe before dismissing someone. I looked up. Earth's reinforcement commitments, he said. Has there been any updated communication from your command? Every eye in the room, every eye, every sensory cluster, every bioluminescent attention node turned toward me. I set down the cup. Nothing new, I said. Priel made a sound that translated, roughly, as polite disappointment dressed up as professional concern. Sothvaren's 4 focal eyes settled on me with the specific weight of a being who had decided, years ago, what I was worth, and had not found reason to revise that figure. Humans contribute presence, he said to the room rather than to me, not power. A junior officer near the end of the table, young, probably his first deployment, antennae still fully expressive in the way they flatten with age and caution, made a sound that I was fairly sure was a laugh. Not cruel, just reflexive. The way you laugh at something that is simply true. I looked at the projection. The Krethian staging zones glowed red against the dark of the outer rim. All that firepower sitting patient and enormous at the edge of Alliance territory, waiting for a moment that everyone in this room agreed was coming. I thought about the temperature of my coffee. I thought about a shipyard I had visited once, 3 years ago, on a gray planet that didn't have a proper name yet, just a designation number. The kind of planet you build things on when you don't want anyone asking what you're building. I thought about my brother's face when he showed me the dry dock. I thought about the name on the hull of the first ship. The retreat formation, Sothvaren was saying, should be initiated no later than 48 standard hours before the Krethian vanguard crosses the Reach threshold. Any later and the corridor becomes a... My comm pinged. 1 short ping, personal channel, encrypted. 2 characters on the screen. Human military code. The kind that didn't have a name in any Alliance communication manual, because it had never been submitted to any Alliance communication manual. I read it. I read it again because I had been waiting 11 months to read it, and I wanted to make sure I was not making it into something it wasn't. I wasn't. I put the calm face down on the table. I picked up my coffee, still wrong temperature. I drank it anyway. Soth Varen was still talking. Retreat vectors, defensive staging, the math of careful loss. I let him finish the sentence. The shadows, behind the Krethian fleet. In the dark space they had positioned their flank against because nothing was there. Nothing had ever been there. Nothing had registered on any scan. Nothing had moved or powered up or made a single detectable noise in 7 months. We're full. I knew because I had put them there. The debrief room off the port corridor was small and smelled like recycled air and old decisions. I had used it 3 times before, twice to file routine status reports that no one read, once to have a conversation with my command superior that I would not be documenting anywhere. Tonight, I used it to sit alone with a cup of coffee that was, for the first time all day, the right temperature. I had 40 minutes before the night cycle brought foot traffic back to this corridor. I pulled up the manifest on my personal terminal, not the Alliance-shared one, the other one, the one that lived behind 2 layers of encryption and a 3rd layer that wasn't encryption so much as the manifest not officially existing anywhere that anyone would think to look. The file was called something boring, supply chain logistics, secondary allocation, the kind of file name that makes people's eyes slide off it and onto something more interesting. I had named it myself. I was proud of that, in a quiet way I didn't talk about. I opened it. 31 entries, each one a ship, each one carrying a name from a list that Command had let the crews choose themselves, which in retrospect said something about what kind of crews they were. You don't name a ship after dark things unless you already understand what the ship is for. I read the list the way you reread something you have memorized, not because you have forgotten it, but because the act of reading it does something to you that memory alone doesn't. 31 ships. None of them appeared in the Alliance Fleet Registry. None of them had ever been submitted for Alliance tonnage review under the Concord of Reach. None of them had transmitted a standard identification signal in 7 months. The Concord of Reach was signed 22 years ago. I was 16. I remembered watching the broadcast with my father, who was career Navy, and sat through the whole ceremony with the expression of a man eating something he was not going to comment on. The treaty capped human military tonnage in Alliance-shared sectors. It defined deployment limits, weapon classification thresholds, and engagement protocols. Every human diplomat involved had signed it with enthusiasm that was, depending on who you asked, either genuine or extraordinary in its performance. What the treaty did not cap was experimental classification. What it did not define, with any precision that would hold up under scrutiny, was shadow tonnage, ships that carried no standard drive signature, ships built with hull materials that scattered sensor sweeps rather than reflecting them, ships that ran on minimal power output for months at a stretch, not powered down, not dormant, just quiet in the way that certain animals are quiet before they are no longer quiet. The Vekari had good lawyers, exceptional ones by all accounts. They had read the Concord 17 times in the first year alone. They had flagged 4 ambiguities and 2 definitional gaps. They had not flagged the right ones. Not because they were careless, because they were looking for what they expected to find for humans trying to sneak conventional firepower through a diplomatic loophole, bigger guns with new names, faster ships dressed up as freighters. That was the playbook they were reading against. Nobody reads the playbook that isn't there. I scrolled through the manifest, ship names, crew complements which I would not be thinking about right now, positional coordinates, each one updated automatically every 6 hours, each one showing a location in deep space that corresponded, if you overlaid it on the tactical map of the outer rim, to a very specific region of apparently empty darkness sitting directly behind the Krethian Dominion's chosen flanking position. They had picked that position because it was empty. It had been empty when they surveyed it. It had been empty when they ran their pre-staging scans. It had been empty for every reading they had taken in the 3 months since they first started massing on the rim. Commander Lorne, who ran the insertion operation, had told me once that the hardest part was not the cloaking technology, which was genuinely impressive. The hardest part was crew discipline. 31 ships, hundreds of people, 7 months of sitting still in the dark, running minimal systems, eating cold rations because hot food produced a thermal signature, and watching through passive sensors as the Krethian fleet slowly, methodically positioned itself around them. "They drove right past us," he had said the last time we spoke. "I mean that literally. One of their patrol ships passed inside 2 kilometers of the Ardent. 2 kilometers, I could see running lights." He had sounded like someone trying not to be impressed with himself, which was how he usually sounded. I closed the manifest. 41 minutes had passed. I had a status report to file. I filed it, standard language, nothing unusual to report. Alliance Council meeting, routine strategic discussion. Human liaison presence noted by senior command. No significant developments. I sent it. Then I sat for a moment in the quiet. There was a shipyard on a gray planet with a designation number instead of a name. I had been there once. My brother had walked me through Dry Dock 7 on a morning when it was raining, the thin, relentless kind of rain that doesn't feel dramatic, just permanent. He had pointed at the hull of the first ship, and I had read the name, and I had not said anything for a long time. He had not asked me what I was thinking. That was the thing about my brother. He always knew when there was nothing to say that would fit the size of the moment. I picked up my coffee, still the right temperature. I drank it. Tomorrow the Krethian Dominion's advanced scouts would cross the first sensor threshold. Soth Varen would begin moving pieces into his retreat formation. Every non-human strategist in this sector would be running their calculations, checking their math, confirming what they already knew about the balance of power and where it sat and what humanity's decorative military presence was good for. And behind the Krethian fleet, in the dark that everyone had agreed was empty, 31 ships would be waiting. They had been waiting for 7 months. They were very good at it. I thought about what Soth Varen's face was going to do when the stars lit up. I finished the coffee and went to bed. They arrived 3 hours early. That was the first thing. Not the scale of it, not the formation, not the weapon signatures lighting up every tactical display on the bridge simultaneously. The first thing was that they were 3 hours early, and that meant someone on the Krethian side had intelligence we didn't know they had, and the entire Alliance response timeline was already wrong before a single order was given. I was on the bridge of the Sovereign Patience when the proximity alert hit, not because I had been invited, because I had gotten up at 400 with the specific feeling behind my sternum that today was not a day for being in the right place at the wrong time. Soth Varen was already at the command position. He had 4 of his 8 limbs active, which for him was the equivalent of someone else rolling up their sleeves. The tactical display was rendering the Krethian fleet in real time, pulling in data from every sensor relay in the sector, and building a picture that got worse with every update cycle. The first number that appeared in red was the Vanguard count. 64 warships, then 67, the system was still counting. The second number was the weapon tonnage calculation. The Alliance tactical AI rendered it in red, then in a deeper red, then stopped using red because the color had stopped meaning anything, and switched to a pulsing amber outline around the number that communicated, if you were reading it correctly, that the system itself was unsure how to present this information in a way that was useful rather than simply alarming. I stood near the back of the bridge. I was not at a console. I was not in anyone's way. I was holding a cup of coffee that I had not drunk from because the bridge recycler had been running hot and it tasted like metal and regret. Sothvaran began issuing orders. Retreat formation, Delta configuration. All Alliance vessels to pull back toward the Reach corridor on his mark. Dorian frigates to screen the withdrawal. He was precise. He was fast. He was, by any reasonable measure, making the correct call. The math was not complicated. He was still right about that. Commander Priel was at the secondary display, already coordinating with the other Alliance command ships. Withdrawal timelines, casualty projections, the language of losing carefully, which was still losing, but which was better than losing recklessly. I watched Sothvaran work. He was a good admiral. That was the difficult part. He was not arrogant in the way that gets people killed. He was careful and precise, and he did not let pride override calculation. He had just calculated with the information he had, and the information he had was incomplete. Commander Vasquez. My name, same weight as always. The diplomatic formality weight. I looked up from my untouched coffee. Your command, he said. Any updated communication? It was not a question. It was the verbal equivalent of going through the motions. He already knew the answer was no. He had already adjusted for the answer being no. The retreat formation he was building did not include human reinforcements because you do not build around a variable you cannot count on. The bridge was running loud alerts, data calls, coordination channels, the background noise of a military vessel in a crisis shifting into a higher gear. Every officer at every station was doing something. The screens were full of red. I set the coffee down on the edge of a console. Don't issue that order, I said. The bridge did not go quiet, but Sothvaran's attention shifted in a way that changed the room without changing anything visible. All four of his focal eyes rotated toward me. The junior officers nearest me kept working because they were disciplined, but the quality of their attention changed, the kind of listening that looks like not listening. Commander, Sothvaran said, and his voice had the texture of a door being held very firmly closed from the other side. The retreat formation is the appropriate response to a force of this. I know, I said. Don't issue it yet, give me 2 minutes. The four focal eyes did not blink. Vakari don't blink the way humans do, but Sothvaran had a stillness when he was deciding something that functioned the same way. Total attention concentrated to a single point. 2 minutes, he said. I pulled out my comm, personal channel, encrypted, the same channel that had pinged me the night before with 2 characters. I typed 2 characters back. The same 2. Confirmation code, the one that meant now. I put the comm in my pocket. I picked up the coffee. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. The bridge was noise and light, and every screen updating faster than a person could comfortably track. Sothvaran held the retreat order. His posture communicated very clearly that he was doing this as a professional courtesy, and that his patience had a specific and rapidly approaching limit. Priel turned from the secondary display. Admiral, the withdrawal window. Then the sensor array screamed. Not literally, but the sound a tactical display makes when 31 new contacts appear simultaneously in a region that has been registering as empty for 7 months is a specific, distinctive, deeply unusual sound that every person on that bridge would remember for the rest of their lives. The contacts appeared behind the Krethian fleet, inside their flanking formation. Between their rear support vessels and the staging zones, they had spent 3 months positioning themselves to defend. Not approaching from outside, already there, already in place, already in a firing arc that should not have been physically possible from that position, except that it was possible if you had been sitting in that position, in total silence, for 7 months, while the enemy built their formation around you without knowing you existed. 31 ships went from cold silent, nothing to full active status in 8 seconds. Sothvaren made a sound. I had served on his ship for 11 months. I had sat through 47 council meetings, 6 emergency briefings, and 2 actual engagements. I had heard Sothvaren speak in 9 different registers: command, diplomacy, irritation. Academic precision, the specific tone he used when he thought someone was wasting his time. I had never heard him make that sound before. I did not have a word for it. I filed it somewhere useful. "Those are human ships," Priel said. He was reading the identification data coming off the newly active contacts. His color was cycling through shades I had never seen on him before. "Those are, how long have they?" 7 months, I said. Nobody said anything for a moment. On the tactical display, the Krethian fleet was registering the new contacts. Their formation, which had been moving forward in the clean and confident way of a force that knows exactly how much stronger it is than the thing in front of it, began to hesitate. You could see it on the display. The hesitation. 67 warships that had done their math and liked their numbers suddenly needing to do the math again with a very different set of variables. Behind them, where nothing had been and nothing had moved for 7 months, 31 ships that were named after things that go wrong in the dark were powering weapons that had been waiting a long time to be used. "Hold the retreat," Sothvaren said. His voice was completely level. I drank my coffee, still wrong temperature. "Good enough." Lorne's voice came through my earpiece, clipped and dry the way it always was. The way that people who have been doing something dangerous for long enough stop performing calm and just become it. "Vasquez, we're live. Confirm authorization." "Authorized," I said. "Copy that." A half-second pause. "Been a while." 7 months. 7 months. I could hear him almost smile, clocks running. The engagement started with the kind of violence that tactical displays are not really built to represent. Displays show you arrows and contact markers and weapon discharge vectors rendered as neat geometric lines. What they do not show you is 31 ships opening up simultaneously from a position that the Krethian fleet's entire battle plan had assumed was empty, hitting from an angle that their shield configurations were not oriented to handle, at a range that their rear support vessels had not been designed to survive. The Krethian formation broke in the first 90 seconds. Not retreated, broke. There is a difference. Retreating is a decision you make. Breaking is what happens when the brain of a military force, the command ships, the communications relays, the vessels holding the whole thing together, takes damage faster than the system can root around it. I was watching the display with Sothvaren 4 feet to my left. He had not ordered me away from the tactical station, which was the closest he was going to get, in the middle of an active engagement, to acknowledging that I belonged there. Priel was running the Alliance-side coordination, keeping the Vekari and Dorian ships in holding positions, ready to push forward if Lorne's formation needed support, keeping them clear of the engagement envelope so nobody accidentally took a shot at a ghost ship, because nobody had bothered to share the targeting identifiers. That had been a planning conversation I had handled 8 months ago, in a document that also did not officially exist. "Krethian command ship is maneuvering," a bridge officer reported. "Bearing change, looks like they're trying to reorient the—" "They can't," I said. "The Ardent and the Vigilance are already bracketing that lane." The officer looked at me, looked at the display. The Ardent and the Vigilance, 2 of Lorne's 31, were, in fact, already bracketing that lane, had been moving to do so for the past 4 minutes before the command ship started its turn, because Lorne had anticipated it and Lorne's crews had been sitting in the dark for 7 months with nothing to do but study Krethian tactical doctrine, until they knew it better than they knew each other's faces. 7 months is a long time to study something. The Krethian command ship aborted its maneuver. On the display, the big red formation that had been advancing on the Alliance fleet, with the momentum of something that had already decided how this ended was fragmenting at the edges. Individual vessels peeling away, trying to find angles that didn't exist, trying to regroup around a rear support structure that was no longer where it had been. Lorne's ships moved through that confusion the way that things move when they have been patient for a very long time, and patience has run its full course. I watched a man at the far end of the bridge, young officer, looked like first or second deployment, antennae still expressive in the way that age and combat flatten them, watching the display with his mouth slightly open. Not afraid. Something past afraid on the other side of it. The expression you get when something happens that reorganizes your understanding of what is possible. I recognized it. I had worn it once, standing in a dry dock in the rain, reading a name on a hull. Sothvaren spoke, without looking away from the display. Your command planned this before the Krethian massing began. It was not a question. Longer than that, I said. How long? The insertion planning started 14 months ago. The ships were in position before the Krethian Dominion finished selecting their staging zones. A long pause, then you knew they would mass here. We knew they were likely to. We knew where they would want to flank from. We knew what empty space looked like to a Krethian advance scout. I looked at the display. We made the space look right. Another pause. This one had a different texture. The kind of silence that happens when someone is revising a very large number of assumptions simultaneously. The Concord of Reach, he said. Is a good treaty, I said. We honor it. He turned two of his focal eyes toward me. The ships are not classified under any tonnage category the Concord defines. I kept my voice even. Our lawyers are also quite good, Admiral. Something moved across the surface of Sothvaren's carapace. A ripple in the pale ridging along his upper frame that I had learned, in 11 months, was the Vekari equivalent of a very deep breath. Commander Lorne to Vasquez, Lorne's voice in my earpiece again. Krethian Admiral is broadcasting on open comms, wideband looking for command response. I touched my earpiece. What are they saying? Requesting cease engagement negotiation. Wants to talk to Alliance Command Authority. I looked at Sothvaren. He had turned back to the display. His posture straightened, the shift of a senior officer preparing to respond to a diplomatic contact. Admiral, I said. He paused. Let me answer it. His four focal eyes settled on me again. That considering stillness. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a being who had just revised a very significant portion of his working model of reality and was not yet done with that revision, he stepped back from the comm panel. I stepped forward. I keyed the channel open. Broad transmission, received by every ship in the engagement zone. The Krethian Admiral's voice came through, deep, formal. The register of a commander who had trained for surrender protocols the way all commanders do, in the abstract, as a thing that happens to other people. I let him finish. I responded. 12 seconds. I will not repeat what I said here in this accounting, because some communications belong to the moment they were made and lose their function when they are written down and explained. What I will say is that I spoke 4 sentences, and that the Krethian Admiral did not respond, and that 11 seconds after I closed the channel, his fleet began moving. Away. Not carefully, not in the organized way that a retreating force moves when it has managed the withdrawal. The Krethian Dominion's fleet moved the way things move when they have understood something fundamental about their situation, and have decided that distance is the only available response. Lorne's ships held position, did not pursue. That was also in the plan. The bridge of the sovereign patience was quiet. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of people who have just watched something happen that they will be describing for the rest of their careers, and who are in the first moments of understanding the size of what they saw. I found my coffee, the one I had set down before sending the confirmation code. It had been sitting on the edge of the console for the entire engagement. Wrong temperature. I drank it. Soth Varen was looking at the display, where the Krethian contacts were resolving from red to amber as they crossed outside engagement range and kept going. His carapace ridging was still. His 8 limbs were arranged in the particular configuration that, on a human being, would have been called standing very still and thinking very hard. After a long moment he said, without turning toward me, "How long have you known?" I held the cup. He had asked the question on the surface. The question underneath it was different, and we both knew it. The question underneath was, "How long have you been this, and what does it mean that I did not see it?" I answered the one underneath. "Long enough," I said, "to know you would only believe it if you saw it." He did not respond. Neither did I. The display showed 31 human ships holding position in empty space, running lights up for the first time in 7 months, and for a long moment that was the whole story. The formal debrief was held 31 hours after the Krethian fleet crossed the outer sensor boundary and kept going. 31 hours because that was how long it took to confirm the withdrawal was genuine and not a regrouping maneuver, to run initial damage assessments across all Alliance vessels. None of Lorne's ships had taken significant damage, a detail I absorbed without expression when I read the report, and to assemble the senior Alliance Council membership across 6 systems via secure relay. I was not seated at the main table. Nobody had said I shouldn't be. There was no protocol that addressed my position specifically, which was part of the point. I took a chair at the back of the room, near the wall, in the row where junior support staff and technical aides sat. Nobody commented on this. Nobody told me to move up. Soth Varen opened the session. He was precise. He was complete. He presented the engagement data without editorializing, the Krethian approach, the timeline discrepancy, the Alliance response readiness, and then, in the same level voice he used for all of it, the emergence of 31 unregistered human vessels from a position inside the Krethian formation's established boundary perimeter. The room took that in. A Vicari Council member whose name translated approximately to High Deliberator Korath, and who had been part of the original Concord of Reach negotiation team 22 years ago, was very still for a very long time after Soth Varen finished the relevant section. Unregistered, Korath said. Unregistered under existing Alliance classification frameworks, Soth Varen said. And under the Concord. The Concord definitions are specific to conventional tonnage categories. Soth Varen paused. The human vessels do not fall within those categories. Another period of stillness. Around the table, the various council representatives were processing at their own speeds and in their own ways, Vicari carapace ridges shifting, Dorian's secondary eyes widening, the Palian delegate cycling through 3 shades of communicative pigmentation in rapid succession, before settling on something that read, "If you knew the color vocabulary," as specifically the feeling of realizing you have been misreading a situation for a long time and are now backfilling. Korath turned. He found me at the back of the room. He looked at me the way you look at something you had categorized and now need to recategorize. "Commander Vasquez," he said, "you were embedded in this command structure for the duration of the period in question." 11 months, I said. "And you were aware?" "Of what my command was doing, yes." "And you communicated nothing to this council." He said it without accusation. He was past accusation. He was somewhere in the territory of trying to understand the dimensions of something. For 11 months. "No," I said. "I communicated nothing relevant to this council." The word relevant sat in the room for a moment. "That is," the Palian delegate said in careful common tongue, "a meaningful distinction." "It is," I agreed. Korath leaned forward. He was older than Soth Varen, which meant he had lived through enough history that very little surprised him, and the things that did surprised him thoroughly. "Why?" he said. "I am asking this as a genuine question, not as a procedural challenge. Why did humanity not disclose this capability to its allies?" I had thought about how to answer this question for about 9 months. I had drafted 3 different versions. I had discarded all of them because they were all, in different ways, too careful, too diplomatic, too much the language of someone managing a relationship rather than describing a reality. "Because disclosure requires trust," I said, "and trust requires a history of being trusted." The room was quiet. "The Concord of Reach caps our conventional tonnage," I continued. "The provision was agreed to because the Alliance considered human military capability to be, at best, a variable of moderate importance, at worst, something to be managed." I paused. "We signed the Concord, we honor the Concord, but we are not obligated to announce capabilities that the Concord does not address. Especially not to a coalition that has spent 22 years deciding what we contribute is presence rather than power." I did not look at Soth Varen when I said this. I looked at Koreth. "You called it presence," I said. "We called it positioning." Another silence. A different kind. The kind that means something is being understood rather than just heard. The debrief continued for another 2 hours. Tactical breakdowns, capability assessments, questions about the insertion operations logistics that I answered where I could, and referred to Lorne's after-action report where I couldn't. The tone of the room shifted slowly. The way tones shift when a group of people is collectively updating something fundamental about its assumptions, and trying to do that while also maintaining professional composure. When the session closed, most of the council moved into smaller groups immediately, the kind of urgent, low-voiced conversations that follow a large recalibration. I watched Koreth speak quietly with 2 other senior members, their heads together, and I did not need to hear what they were saying to know the subject. Soth Varen found me by the door. Not the main door, where the council was filing out. The side door, the utilitarian one, that led back to the working sections of the ship. He came to stand beside me with the deliberate movement of someone who has decided to have a conversation and is not yet certain what the conversation will contain. We stood there for a moment. "The insertion operation," he said. "The 14 months of planning, the 7 months of the ships being in position." He paused. "At any point, if the Krethian Dominion had not moved against Alliance territory, if the threat had not materialized, the ships would have stood down," I said. "Returned to their point of origin. Nobody would have known they were there." "And would you have told us?" "No," I said. He absorbed this. "And if the Krethian Dominion moves again," he said, "if they regroup, resupply, return in greater numbers, then we'll have something in place for that too." I looked at the side door. "Probably already do." I heard the sound he made. The same one from the bridge, but quieter, smaller, more internal. The sound of a very experienced person discovering that the map they have been using is not the same scale as the territory. "You've been doing this," he said, "for how long?" This was the real question, the one that the debrief hadn't asked because it was too large for a formal session. How long had humans been moving in the dark, in the quiet, in the spaces between what the Alliance saw and what was actually there? How deep did the habit go? I thought about my father watching the Concord of Reach ceremony with that specific expression. I thought about a gray planet in the rain. I thought about a whole name I had read once and never said out loud. "The Vekari have a word," I said, "for the patience you exercise when you know something that you are waiting for others to discover on their own." Soth Varen waited. "We don't have a word for it," I said. "We just have the habit." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the viewport at the end of the corridor, the stars were doing what they always do, nothing visible, everything moving. Somewhere out there, 31 ships were running their lights and letting their crews eat hot food for the first time in 7 months. Lorne was probably filing the longest after-action report in the history of a fleet that did not officially exist. The crews were probably doing what crews do when the long, quiet thing is over, talking too loud, laughing at things that are not that funny, feeling the specific relief of a body that has been held still for a long time finally being allowed to move. 7 months in the dark, hundreds of people, sitting patient and silent while the Krethian Dominion built its formation around them and calculated its certainties and ran its math, and decided that the empty space at its flank was safe. The math had not been wrong exactly. It had just been working from incomplete information. Sothvaren said, "Is there anything else I should know?" I considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Probably," I said, "but not today." He looked at me for a long moment, the 4 focal eyes, the stillness that meant consideration. Then something moved in the pale ridging of his upper carapace, not the deep breath ripple from the bridge, something different, something that took me a moment to identify. I thought it might be the closest Sothvaren came to reluctant respect. I had never seen it before. I catalogued it carefully. He turned and walked back toward the main corridor without saying anything else. I stayed at the side door for a while. The corridor was empty. The debrief room behind me was clearing out. Down on the flight deck, 3 levels below, Lorne's ships were queuing for approach, running lights up, drives hot, visible and loud for the first time in a season. They would dock in rotation. The crews would come aboard. There would be debriefs and medical checks and the administrative machinery of bringing 3 dozen ghost ships back into a reality that could officially acknowledge them. I thought about the Outer Rim, about the Krethian Dominion, moving fast and far, back toward the territory it had come from, doing its own recalculations. The math of an operation that had been built on a foundation that turned out not to exist. The particular recalibration of a military force that has learned, in the most direct way possible, that empty space is not the same as safe space. They would be back. Maybe not next season, maybe not in this Admiral's command tenure, but they would be back, because forces like the Krethian Dominion do not recalibrate permanently from a single engagement. They learn, they adapt, they return. When they came back, the Alliance would need to be ready in ways that it was not ready now. Not just with the ships, but with the understanding of what the ships represented, of what it meant to have an ally that thought in timescales longer than a deployment cycle, that planned for contingencies nobody had announced, that moved in the dark as a matter of philosophy rather than desperation. That was the conversation Korath was having right now, in whatever quiet corner of this ship he had found. That was the revision Sothvaren was running. That was the document that would come out of this debrief, the one that would restructure Alliance thinking about humanity's military contribution for the next 20 years. I had not written that document. I would not be asked to. But I had put 31 ships in the dark for 7 months, and that document was writing itself. I found my last cup of coffee. I had left it on a small shelf by the side door at the beginning of the debrief, and it was still there, cold, way past the temperature that any reasonable person would drink it at. The Vekari have a word for strategic patience. We don't. We just call it what it is, knowing what you are, making sure the right people find out at the right moment, and being willing to sit in the dark for as long as it takes to make that moment mean something. I drank the coffee. It was terrible. Good enough.